All right, let's get started. Good evening. My name is Barrett Jones, and tonight I'm talking about early electronic music studios. This is part of this History of Synthesizer series that I've been doing for the past couple of months. Last month we covered a broad array of uh, different examples of the use of synthesizers in popular music. This month we'll dig a little deeper. Today we'll be talking about early electronic music studios, and then the next webinar for this month we'll talk about some composers. Tonight we'll talk about some composers as well, but the focus really is on three centers for electronic music. And the reason why we've singled these out to talk about them tonight is because in the early development of the synthesizer, the equipment was huge and expensive and could only be housed and operated in academic settings for the most part, or in the case of the BBC, uh, a large television and radio broadcasting shop. So the average consumer, the typical musician, did not have access to any form of synthesizer. It was in these studios that musicians first were exposed to synthesizers and began working with them to compose music. And so these electronic music studios really were a cornerstone in the development of electronic music. When the 70s arrived, synthesizers, as we saw in our overview last month, synthesizers became smaller and more accessible and more affordable. But in the 60s and the 50s, the early years of electronic music, synthesizers still were based in large centers. And we're looking at three of them tonight. The Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center, which was in New York City. Actually, it's still going in a newer form. The San Francisco Tape Music Center out in San Francisco, California. And then the BBC Radiophonic Workshop over in London, England. And these three studios were all operating roughly in the same time. The Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio started in the late 50s, as did the Radiophonic Workshop. The San Francisco Tape Music Center started in the early 60s. Um, all three of these studios became a testbed and creative outlet for musicians who did not have access to this technology in any other way. And all three of these studios also are a good example of a period in time of a transition from using what was available at hand at that point, which were tapes, to using actual analog synthesizers that were custom built. So let's dive right in and first talk about the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center in New York. This was a joint venture between Columbia University and Princeton University. The primary founders of this center were Milton Babbitt and Vladimir Ussachevsky, along with Otto Luening and Roger Sessions. Vladimir Ussachevsky and Otto Luening actually were the ones who first started the center, and it was really Vladimir Ussachevsky who was the leading light in the founding of this center. It was founded with a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation in 1958 and housed four studios actually housed in on the premises of Columbia University. Now, Ussachevsky was a electronic music composer, and before he began working in the Columbia Princeton facility, he was composing using tape recorders. He was a recognized composer in this medium. Here's a picture of him at work, a wonderful picture of him working with reel-to-reel tapes. And he was a active in what is known as tape music, which was a period of time in the 50s and the 60s where tapes were used to create musics. And so here's an album, a performance at the Museum of Modern Art in 1952. And here is an example of some other compositions and composers created, collected together under the Sounds of New Music, a Folkways record. Let's take a listen to some of his compositions here. Another founder of the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center was Milton Babbitt. Milton Babbitt, an American composer. He was hired as a consultant by RCA, the corporation that built the RCA Mark II synthesizer. Uh, Milton Babbitt became recognized in his own right as a composer and electronic musician who released many pieces, including a couple of pieces composed for the RCA Mark II synthesizer, the 1961 composition for synthesizer and the 1964 ensembles for synthesizer were among his recordings. Let's have a listen of Milton Babbitt using the RCA Mark II. The RCA Mark II was a unique piece of history in the history of synthesizers. It was designed by Vladimir Ussachevsky and an engineer named Peter Mauzy. That basically the idea came up between the two of them, who designed custom components. And the unique thing about this synthesizer was that it was the first programmable synthesizer, so that the program could be written out on sheets of paper, and it basically would be fed through the computer, such as an analogy would be a player piano with a piano roll. Composers who either recorded in the studio or came through the studio in some capacity as workers or students are included in this list. You can see the famous American electronic musician Wendy Carlos, the composer and conductor Edgar Varese, and Charles Wuorinen. Charles Wuorinen, we'll hear a little piece by him. Here's some other examples of recordings that were done in the Music Center, early recordings of synthesized music, these by Charles Dodge. Charles Wuorinin's Times Encomium was the winner of the 1970 Pulitzer Prize for Music, as you can see from this cover. And this was recorded using the Mark II synthesizer. Let's have a listen. So moving right along, we'll have to leave that. It's a much longer recording than what you heard. We'll move on to the San Francisco Tape Music Center. The San Francisco Tape Music Center was founded in 1962 by the composer and teacher Morton Subotnick and Ramon Sender. The San Francisco Tape Music Center didn't last long independently. It was incorporated into Mills College in 1966. But between the years of 62 and 66, the San Francisco Tape Music Center served as a workshop and a haven for many West Coast electronic musicians. It was also deeply embedded in the San Francisco community in the 60s and was host to uh, many visiting musicians, even from rock bands of the era. Um, Morton Subotnick is well known not only as a composer and instructor, but the creator of the album Silver Apples of the Moon, which is regarded as a electronic music classic. And we'll talk about the development of that in a minute. Ramon Sender, who co-founded the Tape Center, is a composer, visual artist, and writer. Uh, Both of these men were active in the San Francisco music scene. Let's listen to some early tape compositions created by Ramon Sender at the around the time of the San Francisco Tape Music Center. Let's hear this composition from 1962. It starts out very quietly. And in the interest of time, we'll move on and listen to the third piece created in 61. You can hear the influence of musique concrète in these compositions. Composers who did their work in the San Francisco Tape Music Center included Joseph Byrd, William McGinnis, Tony Martin, Paulino Oliveros, who we'll talk about in the next webinar, Steve Reich, and Terry Riley, who we'll also cover later. Major figures in American music. Here's a photo from the era of some of these composers at work in the center. The center is also known as the place where Morton Subotnick worked with an engineer named Don Buchla to develop an early analog synthesizer. Subotnick commissioned Buchla to build a modular analog um, electronic music system, which he called the Buchla Box. Its formal name is the 100 Series Module Electronic Music System. Subotnick worked with Buchla to design and build this, and this instrument is what was used to record Subotnick's Silver Apples of the Moon. Let's have a listen. Let's move on to the last electronic music studio that we'll talk about tonight over in London. That was the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which is also still going now in a new revised form. The workshop was an outgrowth of the BBC's work on radio programs. The BBC used engineers in their studio to create sound effects and theme music for their radio programs. As the programs became more and more complex and more imaginative, the demands of the soundtrack increased for wider range of effects um, and things that a normal orchestra could not do. So by 1958, the BBC decided to open a radiophonic workshop in their studios, and it was established by Daphne Oram and Desmond Briscoe with the intent to create sound effects for radio programs. They did so for many years. And then in the 60s, as television began to take more and more hold, the BBC, of course, moving into television, creating television shows. Once again, the Radiophonic Workshop was tasked to create jingles, theme music, and sound effects for television shows, as well as continuing to create um, music for BBC Radio. The reason for this was, as I say, that the demands of the art form in the case of radio and television outstripped what could be produced by traditional musicians. And so these early electronic musicians used tapes, oscillators, and eventually early modular analog synthesizers to create effects that otherwise were unable to be produced by traditional instruments. Over the years, or at least in the heyday of the 50s and the 60s, the staff of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop included these people. I want to pick out especially the two women who were on the forefront of composing electronic music at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. You notice in our webinar tonight there have not been, we did mention Pauline Oliveros, and we will talk about her again in the next webinar, but the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was managed by a woman, Daphne Oram. In 1957, this is essentially the genesis of how the Radiophonic Workshop began. In 1957, Oram composed music for the play Amphitryon 38 using only electronic sources. This was the first time in the history of the BBC that music had been composed using completely electronic sources. A milestone event for the BBC. The producers and management liked the work so much that was done for this play that they began commissioning more and more works of a similar type. And so eventually the BBC decided that they need to actually budget and open a studio devoted specifically to the sound. So it really was the work of Daphne Oram in 1957 that started it. She left the radiophonic workshops not too long into the 60s to go branch out on her own and create her own studio and invent a fascinating synthesizer called the Oramix synthesizer, which actually is a synthesizer that interprets shapes, and we'll get into that in another webinar. Another woman who was at the forefront of work at the Radiophonic Workshop was Delia Derbyshire, who is well known and well regarded as a female pioneer in electronic music. And In 1962, she composed the theme song for the BBC television series Doctor Who. This one piece of work by Delia Derbyshire really projected her into um, a high echelon of composers and electronic musicians, because the Doctor Who soundtrack is regarded as one of the first most interesting pieces of electronic music. Derbyshire went on to form something in the 60s called Unit Delta Plus, which was outside of the Radiophonic Workshop. It was sort of an outgrowth of it with some other members of the workshop. And the idea of Unit Delta Plus was to bring electronic music and performances to the public in the manner of concerts and multimedia events. And they worked for several years before disbanding. Derbyshire also went on to invent several instruments. Let's have a listen to the soundtrack for Doctor Who. This is Derbyshire's original version. All right, that was the Delia Derbyshire Doctor Who soundtrack from 1963. So we come to an end of tonight's webinar where we've talked about these three music centers and how it was really a particular time in the development of technology that required the growth of these centers. 10 years later, there was no longer really a need for a specific building devoted to equipment. Synthesizers had become smaller, somewhat more portable, and were consumer grade, consumer level. But for a few years in the 50s and the 60s, synthesizers were specialized custom-built equipment that were only housed in certain places, usually connected to academia or the government, as the BBC and the Columbia Princeton centers were. Although we also saw on the West Coast the San Francisco Tape Music Center, which was, although working off of funds from nonprofit foundations and was eventually absorbed into academic center, was initially an independent center that was very much involved with the arts and music community in San Francisco. So hopefully this webinar gave somewhat of a sampling of the rich history of each one of these centers. And in the next webinar this month, we're going to talk about some of the composers that we encountered tonight and some other ones that we didn't, highlighting some of these early pioneers in electronic music who really helped shape the genre and who are regarded as being the forerunners of much of what since then has become such a multifaceted and rich uh, area of music coming from all different forms of electronic music synthesis. So that's it for tonight. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach me, Barrett, at dcbclub.com. Thank you very much. Good night.